But he spent 12 hours in planes and airports yesterday to be here today. So we want to thank him for his dedication and patience in getting here. Yeah. I just say try arranging flights from Ottawa to Marquette and then back in 2 days. It's crazy. Some of the routes were just insane. We were fortunate to get one that he only had to fly to Newark and then Chicago, and then Detroit. Yeah, so he has to go to Montreal to get home. So he has a trip back tomorrow. So would you please welcome from Ottawa, Dr. Sebastien Mallette.
Okay, hello. Thank you for that introduction. So it's the end of the day or almost, so hopefully I'm going to have a good conversation with you. I'm going to try to do that a bit formally and informally to try to capture a sense of conversation among ourselves. It's always special for me to present on these topics, obviously, because this is so much more than just, I would like to think, academic material or knowledge per se. It's a way of being for the so-called, back in the day, the French Indian people, or the Sans-Mêlés, the Métis, the descendant of the half-breeds, and so on. So for us, the fur trades, for us, the knowledge that you've been given since this morning, it's part of our living history. And these relationships are still valued for us in terms of who we are and how we walk the day and the night. So basically what happened is that it's always nerve-wracking to give these conversations. And first of all, I'm in French. I'm a French speaker, so to talk to you in English sometimes can be challenging. And if something I'm saying it's not correct or well understood, please tell me. I've learned English language when I was doing my PhD at the University of Victoria late in my life. So meeting John Burroughs, among other great folks. So anyways, this is just to say that it's a challenging subject, and I will just like to cue in one thing to Martin, if you're interested into this court case, Boucher 2021. I don't know if you heard of it in New Brunswick. It's a recent case for non-status Indians that won Section 35 rights for the first time. Not a lot of people are talking about it, and especially, well, including First Nations, are not talking about it due to politics and the fact that Section 35 rights, which are constitutional rights in Canada, are recognized to Indigenous people outside status and outside treaty rights. It's a first, and that leads to a lot of questions when it comes to identity, when it comes to right, when it comes to sovereignty and self-determination. And so if we can talk about it further or after, please let me know, but that's a very interesting court case for us. So anyways, I have those slides presented to you. I have some material that looks in the past in terms of fur trade, in terms of ethnology, in terms of culture, and I've also give like a present or future-orientated aspect to this presentation so that we can look on the values of the past for us in the present in terms of identity markers and how it plays out. So about me, well, I want to thank the Beaumier UP Heritage Center for inviting me, and the University of Northern Michigan, obviously, for hosting us. It's also important to understand that we are on the land as guests of the Kichi Nanibini Zibing, if I pronounce that right, which is the Anishinaabe Confederacy. And I apologize again for my language barrier sometimes playing out. So it's important for us to understand that we're a guest here, and it's especially important for us, the French-Canadian Métis people, to recognize these connections and relationship as we go along. I'm an associate professor of law and legal studies at Carleton University. My field of interest is mainly Métis studies, indigeneity, non-status Indigenous populations in relationship to law. That's essentially what I dwell into. I work with non-recognized Indigenous community up north that are chasing their rights. When it comes to that dream about Canada, for example, there's huge problem when it comes including with treaty rights. Treaty rights are constitutionally protected in Canada per Section 35, but which also means that it comes with the possibility of infringements, constitutional infringement, which means that they are placed under common law order, which means that if for some reason, including economical interest of all Canadians, treaty rights could be infringed. So the self-determination of Indigenous people in Canada, even under treaty, face serious challenges, and many questions are still open to that regard. That's just a comment prior the conversations that we had on Canada and so on, which I'm here to answer more questions if you have to. I have French, Canadian, Métis heritage and Native ancestry myself in the family from both my mother, Pierre, the line is Pierre Chabot and Simforos Morotuwekwe, and my father's line goes back to Michel Bisaillon and Marie Akemasakwe. So these lines and family ancestral relations connect us to the Illinois First Nations in the Kaskaskia surroundings. So it's always special for me to come down here in terms of remembrance and in terms of sightseeings and the relationship. I mean, it's bizarre for me to cross the American line, so to speak, from Canada, because these feels always like somehow artificial lines that have been designed over time. And I'm part of a family that were among the first settlers of Detroit, for example, and other families that were explorers back in the day. The Mallette families are very old families, and we have different branch across the continent and different sets of relationship with Indigenous people. And so basically it's always weird to go across continent and frontiers and to experience this as some way we feel home as Métis people in so many different locations. We feel home as welcomed guests, obviously, always in relationship with First Nations and the Inuit as well. So that this relationship of sharing the lands, of being together relationally is very still important. So my research include various books that we have written on the subject. Here is the 4 books that we did so far in terms of research. Songs Upon the River, which kind of address a continental pictures about Métis culture, and we've tried to tease out the markers of that common cultures and came up with a rhizomatic approach to Métis cultures. Second in order is Les Bois Brûlés de l'Outaouais, which is a more specific study that we did in terms of the Outaouais region, still unceded treaty territories for the Anishinaabe people. And there is a Métis community there that tries to have Section 35 rights recognized for their community. They're still unrecognized. And so I was hired as an expert to try to make expertise for the courts in this kind of weird battles to get their right recognized. I can speak about this further or later on if you wish. That's the English version, Bois Brûlés, next to it at UBC Press, if you want to read it in English, because we thought that this was important to get this message across in both language. And finally, Eastern Métis, quite a contentious subject in Canada. I won't hide it from you. Eastern Métis in Canada are not currently recognized. In Canada, the Western Métis are recognized from the prairies, but the Eastern Métis are not recognized as formally. They are recognized in the Royal Commissions on Aboriginal People going back to the 80s as making claims and as existing, and the elders told their story as well as knowledge provider. But unfortunately, due to politics, in which I'm going to get at this the end of the conversation in the conference, due to politics, including colonial politics and lateral violence, the Eastern Métis are still facing an abrupt road ahead in terms of their recognitions, including by other Métis people across Canada and First Nations with whom they enter into conflicts over rights, over fear of treaties, over things like that. So just to make an anecdote salient, the 3rd book, The Lady on the Cover, we've chose that picture with a very specific message in mind. Her name is Mary Keat on that picture. And Mary Keat, her mother is Marie Cadotte. So I don't know if you know that name, but that's a quite significant name for Métis Circle as well as Anishinaabe nation with whom we share many relationships. So her mother is Marie Cadotte, and her father was chief factor in Montreal, fur trade. And Marie Cadotte is married to Thomas Taylor, which was Red River Métis, going back to the region of Winnipeg in Canada. So that lady and her husband, Thomas Taylor, were existing and living also in the Outaouais region, in the place we did our work. And they were working at Lac des Sables over there in the fur trade industries. So that helps to show that the connections, even in Canada, goes to Red River, to the eastern parts of Canada, per kinship relationship, which are really truly important to us. And also the same Cadotte family that you will find, for example, in le traité de Prairie du Chien in 1825. That treaty also includes the Cadotte family in the United States in this region, as well as the 1835 half-breed census made across this region also include members of the Cadotte family who are related to that lady. So that shows that the history of Michigan, the history of the Outaouais, the history of Red River are all connected per kinship relationship as well as bloodlines. We still value and we still know. And for us, that is the essence of our responsibility and our people as we go forward. And if we're talking about living values from the past connecting to the present, this is really important for us in terms of resilience. The talk we had before mine was talking about treaty, for example, and the responsibility of being a treaty people. Canadians are treaty people. Americans are treaty people. In that regard, we owe responsibility to these treaty relationship, one can suggest. I suggest that strongly. So basically, if there are treaties, and if you want to push them into real law, real things that can change our lives for the better in terms of our relationship, we have to take this in consideration with Indigenous resilience and the possibility to bring back Indigenous populations, communities, and nations to the rise so that an increasing number of people may express those rights, express those values as they get strength, right? But one of the policy has been in Canada as well as in the United States to, yes, sure, ratify treaty in order to secure the land, in order to get the land and resources. But in the same time that treaty policy was made, another policy was for the extermination of Indigenous people when it comes to their identity, their numbers, their recognitions of themselves, and so on, right? So the best antidote to that is to rise those treaty rights, for sure, but in the same time to work on resilience and what it means to be an Indigenous person today in terms of culture, in terms of knowledge from the past and the present connections. So looking in the past, we know that the Case expedition of 1820 hired Canadians as well as voyageurs, in which we suspect Métis people are among them. But we don't have the proper names and the way in which to search that. But it's the same kind of formula that use Indigenous people as well as Canadians as well as guides, you know, that belongs to various Indigenous nations to go forward into the land. Now, if we take another expedition built on the same kind of model to explore the United States, we have obviously the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is another expedition that was modeled along similar lines when it comes to that. And that expedition has been well researched when it comes to the member of that expedition that were named, for example, right? This documentation here, the Métis man from the Lewis and Clark expedition, comes from Laurie Barkwell, an historian at the Louis Riel Institute in Canada, with whom I had the great pleasure to have pipe ceremonies by the Red River when I went to visit him in Winnipeg. Okay, so that historian did an incredible work in trying to map the Métis people that were involved in Canadian as well as American history, and you can find most of its work online, free. So we think about Toussaint Charbonneau, for example, right, among the expedition of Lewis and Clark, that says. You know, if you're a trader coming from Montreal, part Iroquois, and there's few details here that I just want to bring to your attention so that we can connect the dot later. Pierre Cruzet, for example, of Omaha Indian heritage, descendant of the settlers of St. Louis, right, in the United States, a little bit further down south here, right? You have Pierre Dorion Sr., very important members of that expedition, right? Fluent in various different language, again, from marriage alliances, voyageur background, okay? Very important family and instrumental to the success of that expedition. You have Georges Drouillard, who is, by the way, connected to Michigan. He is from this region, so there's a connection even to Michigan within that expedition. He was a very good hunter and a very good protector along the way, and you know the different fights and different occurrences that did happen, sometimes involving indigenous people, but also grizzly bears, for example, attacks that were reported, or other perils along the line of that difficult expedition. There's just René Gessium, French interpreter again, bringing further details to it. François Labiche, Étienne Malbeuf, that was also part of that expedition. Peter Pinault, you can recognize all those French names, as well as Pierre Roy, also described as an half-breed from the Menden village this time. And the children born in this expedition of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, they carried a baby with them, parts of that expedition. And so that brought also peace, because bringing a children and indigenous woman sometimes with them was not a sign of being a war party. So that provided success for their expedition as they were getting into the land and meeting other indigenous people. So that came, interestingly, in that research. So all of these examples that we can, read further and dwell into brings a unique culture in terms of who are the Métis people, right? I would like to suggest to you that this is a unique cumulative, diasporic, and rhizomatic identity. Three concepts that I'm trying to develop here in terms of when it comes to Métis culture. Because if I'm asking you, what is a Métis person? What is a Métis culture? What would be your main guess? Anyone? What is a Métis person? Or what is an half-breed? How would you formulate your answer to that question? Yes? That's right. You'll probably raise the point of intermarriages or being mixed, of being born out of two people. And that's usually the case, but there's way more I would like to suggest to you than this. Yes? Fiddle music. Fiddle music, that's correct. Fiddle music. There's also, there's all kinds of signs and symbols that are part of that culture, intertwined with various First Nations, as we will see, and we'll get to the very definition of Louis Riel, for example. Have you heard of him, Louis Riel? Métis leaders that led to acts of resistance in Canada. Famously or infamously an American citizen, by the way, that was hanged by the British up north, which brings a lot of, still contentions to these days. So what I want to bring in terms of markers from these expeditions, including the case expedition of 1820, are a few points here. So we are talking about Métis people described through inter-ethnic union, various First Nations or Inuit and Euro-Canadians of usually Scottish, Irish, or French descent, right? You'll see in the historical descriptions, French language and Christianity has a significant linguistic and cultural markers. Okay, so you'll see that due to their parentage, having a father Canadian or Scottish, you'll see the children, the Métis children are often Christian, okay, due to their father, but also bearing spiritual qualities and traditions from their mother. So therefore, they're bringing together Christianity and indigenous spiritualities together in strange synthetic forms at times. French language will become predominant, but also the possibility of First Nation languages held together. But French becomes important in the fur trade as lingua franca, as a language that gets across and allows all voyageurs, as well as commis and different staff, to work together, essentially. But at times, when people do not know French, and let's say a Frenchman meets an English person, they will sometimes speak Anishinaabe among themselves if both know that language. So indigenous language are also part of that culture, but plural. You'll see polygamic unions, a different set when it comes to marriage. Maybe the voyageur or the people living among them as freemen will have multiple wives, according to indigenous traditions. They are seen as having shifting loyalties from the standpoint of colonial authorities. Métis, you're not sure of them. Are they Canadians? Are they Americans? Are they faithful to the British, to the Americans, or to their First Nations relations? What's happening with them? They are a source of worrying into these times of colliding empires. Intimate knowledge of the land. You'll see that through their descriptions, right? Wherever these expeditions went, they've met Canadians on the land. Canadians in the United States, Canadiens, as we used to call them, with First Nations embedded, living among them with cultural practices, right? So basically, the land was known by Canadians, explorer and voyageur, as well as freemen living among the First Nations deep into what they called Indian land. You'll see them acting as cultural brokers, interpreters, diplomacy, knower of both worlds, bridge maker through culture. You'll see specific skill, trading, hunting, surviving, scouting, warfare, navigation among their specific sets of skill. Not only voyageur, but also those other ways of life that allow someone to survive, not get lost, and resist to the dangers that may be in the land. If you don't know where to go in the bush, these forests will kill you. You have no way of like knowing where's the river, how to eat, where to go, what plant to know. You'll die in matters of days. And I don't wish it on nobody, but these lands are unforgivable if you don't know them. Hence the value of First Nations to survive, to thrive, to develop. Hence the values also of Métis people that were cultural bridge among those elements of culture. You'll see also in historical descriptions distinctive ethnonym being used. For example, Métis, Bois Brûlé, Half-breed. You'll see those different descriptors, which is important in the sense that we don't have, as a people, as a culture, a single name. And that leads to horrible debate these days. Some people will contest, even today, my identity as a Métis person, in Canada, for example. Despite the fact that I descend from French, Indian, voyageur family, and we will see the common descriptors of that historically speaking. In Canada now, there's big, powerful lobbies that says you don't have the right to call yourself a Métis except if you are from these people and these region, right? So even today, in terms of names, in terms of its polysemic nature, we have difficulties when it comes to name. We have also difficulties when it comes to land. We have difficulties in terms of allegiances, because basically we're a people made of relationships, plural with different nations. We were cultural brokers of the early days, caught into a colonial system that sometimes we took advantage of, and sometimes we suffered from. We have these dual nature and full contradictions even within ourselves and even within our blood. We are part of colonial history, and we were also affected and almost wiped out by colonial history, which brings a very unique touch to our culture and our survival. But we are also a multicultural, multinational people, and we like to think among our circles that our very existence is a treaty in and of itself, which makes the living conditions as a people. We are the people. We go across the American lines, across the Canadian lines, across so many First Nation lines, so that we get together in bridging these culture. Now, already in 1687, we see Mr. de La Salle in the area of Fort St. Louis in the United States, complaining about these people that were Métis and the Canadians that were marrying indigenous women as being too freely in their own ways, as claiming that they were the ownership of their lands. Counter to the French colonial authorities, they were perceived as dangerous people that were giving more loyalty to their First Nations relationship as they should give to their king, the French king in that occurrence, or the colonial authorities. So very early on in the United States, the Métis were perceived as a dangerous, shifting populations due to their proximity with First Nations interest and kinship families. We also find expressions of Métis solidarity right before the Clark expedition in the Illinois. There were like center villages made of so-called Métis people, born out of indigenous and French people coming together, creating these settlements. And we find in some of these book description in the Illinois, in the area where my own ancestors are from, villages of Métis that existed and show solidarity when they were fighting the British, for example. The same village in this part, in this extrait of a book, later on, if you look at Our Debt to the Red Men by Octon, was completely destroyed by American militia in 1820s. Caught in the colonial war between the British and the Americans, often the Métis villages held no chance when it came to their existence and loyalty, and were just massacred. And the remnant people that were saved from this village were saved, in fact, by First Nations from the historical accounts that made a special expedition to rescue the women and the children that survived this ordeal. Early indication of political consciousness among the half-breed. Here you have from Buffalo, again in the United States, a group of half-breed coming from the fur trade that wants to gather as much half-breed and Métis people of so-called Indian blood, to get together to create a republic for all of those with Indian blood. In 1836, this is way prior to Riel. This is way prior to the West history. That shows that the half-breed and the so-called Métis had a consciousness of themselves as a people, as a cause. It was not just a matter of like being breed of two people, of having like just marital relationship, or being viewed as different. It was really about a consciousness that was emerging of a specific status and people that stand together, right? So that is an example that I wanted to offer. Another, perhaps, extract that you already know from Cole in 1855 about the Métis and the Canadiens belonging to the land is "My home is everywhere," right? In this report from early ethnographer Cole, who interviews Métis and Canadian voyageurs back in the days, he asks, "Où restez-vous?" which in French means, "Where do you live?" I ask once a voyageur. And underline here, you can say, "Où je reste, je ne peux pas te le dire." I cannot tell you where I live. I am a voyageur. I am a Chico. Monsieur, je reste partout. I live everywhere. My grandfather was a voyageur. He is dead traveling. And his father was a voyageur. He was also dead traveling. I will die traveling, and another Chico will take my place. Such is our life. So you can say that for the Métis experience, being of various land, decentered when it comes to land, truly existing among relationship rather than ownership of the land, was part of the cultural trait that infused Métis culture and our relationship with the land, right? So all of these examples are made to show that there's a very specific milieu of socialization for the Métis culture, shaped, yes, by intercultural encounters and indigenous kinship, but also mobility due to trade, independence, wanting to be free, wanting to be, tax-free, especially from colonial authorities, specific cultures coming together, French, cultural brokers, as I mentioned, shaped by regional conflicts, including among fur trade companies and contraband, for example, among the voyageurs, Métis people, a quest for freedom, often in tension with colonial authorities, an awareness of their specific identities, and also their Indianness, or their indigeneity, if you will, is always at the fringes for the Métis people, okay? So, time is flying by, and I just want to make some strong points along the way. the Métis people, at least in Canada and parts of the United States, was carved by specific experience. And that specific experience is a rejection of their indigeneity. And that rejection of their indigeneity is along the line of patrilineal descent model, by which Indianness in Canada was attributed according to who is your father. So in the times of annuities in Canada, for example, colonial Canadian authorities had big problems when it comes to money. They had treaties, they had responsibilities to Indigenous people, but some Indigenous people were living across the medicine line or the borders between Canada and the United States. So they come in and off, they're inviting their cousin and stuff like that, and Canadians authorities, they were pulling their hair. Who should we pay? Who should we consider so-called Indians? If we are restricting increasingly their right, how to implement these restrictions or benefit? How to do it when there are so many French Indian men mingling among them? How would we know? And when we went to the archives and we dig into the Indian Affairs Department letters that they were exchanging themselves, we found that basically the Indian Affairs Department is answering back to their Indian agents, look at who's the father. If the father is reputed as white or a Canadian, then their family is white, despite the fact that they could have an Indigenous mothers or bloodline through their mom. But if their bloodline comes from their father's side, they can get on the Indian band list or the annuity list and so on. So basically, it's in part due to a patrilineal descent model that a huge chunk of Indigenous people were pushed away as Indigenous people. But that common experience is livid. It's there for the Métis people to recognize. So all of us that identified as Métis people in Canada, or French-Canadian Métis, or by different names, all our Indigenous so-called ancestral relationships come from women, Indigenous women. And that is the main differences due to colonialisms that we have been created that way. Now, Canada now is backtracking that kind of discrimination against Indigenous women due to different court cases and the way in which non-status Indigenous women fought so hard in Canada to get their right recognized. Now, the government of Canada is giving back Indian status to a lot of non-status and a lot of Métis people that wish their identity recognized. But in doing that, they're not changing their assimilation policy, which means what? Which means that if you are a Métis recognized by Section 35 rights in Canada, your rights in terms of Indigenous rights will be perpetual for all eternity because you're outside of the Indian Act. But the Indian Act has clause in it that if you marry out an Indian person twice, if you have two subsequent marriage outside of the Indian status, your children will lose their Indian status. So it's still a policy of assimilation, and per demographics alone, in less than 100 years, it is predicted that people with status are endangered to lose it all. So it pays off the Canadian Authority, basically, to give back status to people in which they can assimilate back in time per the colonial policy that are still in force. Do you understand that kind of argument? So for the major threat for Canada right now when it comes to colonialisms is the existence of Métis people that will have rights that are recognized in their constitution, infringement possible, but still rights that will stand for all eternity, and the same thing with non-status, hence my indication for the Boucher case, for example, right? But there's another problem with this is that when they are giving certain constitutional protections and privileges to segment of the Métis population in Canada, they're telling the old strategy, oh, you're special. But these guys that only have like remnant of ancient blood so far back that wish to play native, these guys are there to steal your rights. And so there's a lot of divide and conquer policies in Canada that puts Métis people of the West against Métis people of the East, against the North, against the South, and First Nations dealing with their treaties. For example, the Anishinaabe people dealing up north still with the treaties in Ontario and parts of Quebec are really nervous about that because they say, we've worked so hard to get these treaties, and now these newcomers are coming with old bloodlines, and they claim to be us. And the government is giving them a voice. And so you see the mess we're in terms of Canada, in terms of that politics. So who's indigenous now is a high source of anxiety. And so that's why you see in the news these kinds of, quest for Britannians or people that would be shifty in that regard. And even myself, I have been at the center of this controversy, for example, because I'm working so close to non-status indigenous population that are extremely vulnerable to these types of criticism, right? So here, a few more minutes for your patience, but here, this is Louis Riel's assessment of who is a Métis person. The Métis have as paternal ancestor former employee of the Hudson Bay in the Northwestern Company, and as maternal ancestor, Indian women belonging to various tribes. The French word Métis is derived from the Latin participle mixtus, which means mixed. And then Louis Riel in 1885, in its literature, suggests that it represents the ID well. So you see here the patrilineal coding even of Métis identity, right? Father from French and Scottish descent mainly, and indigenous women from different tribes, different nations, which brings a diversity in our people. When a bunch of Métis people get together, like those expeditions of Lewis Case or these other, you'll see Métis people with different language, different possibility, different nation. The Omaha, the Anishinaabe will be recognized. The Mohawk will be in there. So when we get together, basically, we are like kind of a living wampum of so many different nations coming together, not only by blood, but culture as well as language. That was back in the day, and this is still true in terms of our resilience today, which makes us kind of to give an image, the first internet back in the day, right? Or the way in which to communicate among so many different tribes and so many different political interests. And that's no secret that this is why the Métis are so successful in terms of being cultural brokers or involved into diplomacy, okay? This is Louis Riel's picture here, and I just want to bring this to your attention. Riel is describing in those days, in 1877, what would be the Métis nation is trying to create out of this culture which already exists. This consciousness that forms at the frontier in so many different directions, it's already there. But he says, until now, this is my translation from the letter he wrote to his cousin Paul Preux. Until now, the name Métis, has served to designate the race emerging of the mixed blood of European and the savages. But it is also proper to identify a race of man who would be recruited by the mixing of all bloods between them and while shaped by the French-Canadian mold, would keep the remembrance of its origin by calling itself Métis. And then subsequently in the letter, he says, the name Métis would be agreeable to all because it is not exclusive and have the advantage of mentioning in suitable ways the contingent by which each nation would contribute to generate a new people. So you can see that the willingness of bringing a diversity of people in one people and accepting the contingent element of all this is truly revolutionary for the days. And it still is a problem today. That's the original letter here of Louis Riel, written down in 1885. So it is still a problem today. Here is Louis Riel saying to Gabriel Dumont, one of his main general into the act of resistance, that he should be a Métis leader for the western parts of the country, while he would be the Métis of all, the leader of all Métis across North America, or at least the British possessions of North America in that extract. He also recognized the existence of Métis people in Eastern Canada is in correspondence in 1885 with similar rights than those Métis in Manitoba. He wrote that himself. And yet today, in closing, because I only have 3 minutes, but we can talk during the period of questions, I'm sure. But still today, there is huge battle in not recognizing the existence, like I said, in the eastern parts of Canada. But why is that? What is the policy if even Louis Riel himself did recognize the existence of Métis people all across continent, including in the United States? Now see here, down south in the United States, south for us from Canada. So Métis are not recognized. Métis are not recognized as an indigenous people at all. sometimes they will be recognized by indigenous nations here in the United States as part of their nation or certain branch of families that were Métis and now including in First Nations identity. And that's fine. But up in Canada, they make a distinguished, very unique form of identity recognized now in Section 35 of our Constitution. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution recognizes Indians, Métis, and Inuit as indigenous peoples of Canada with specific rights. But now the battle is up for identities. Who are the Métis? Who could be Inuit? Who can be Indian is still really much debated in terms of colonial politics, privilege, access to recognitions, and more. So I've prepared way too many slides. I was too optimistic, but I would be happy to answer any questions you may have for the remaining 15 seconds, and I thank you for your patience and your time today.
Fantastic.
Is there any Métis people who were white passing enough that would just say they were white in French and then that lost their history of being mixed?
Absolutely. So in all the families that I've traveled to in Canada, went into the West, North, South, even Métis families are often divided amongst themselves. So there's part of the family that will reject that heritage and say, no, we're just white, it just happened. And other people that are really it's at the forefront of their identities. If you go back in history, the Métis people were also playing on the line, like I said. So for sometimes, like Johnny Grant, for example, who had ranches and was a famous Métis person, he wrote an autobiography of himself, and at one point he says, I'm a Canadian. In the other part of his biography, he says, I'm Métis. And in the other part of his biography, he says, I'm Indian, right? So basically those identity that you guys hold as separate, here's the white, here's the Indian, they never should become together. These should be segregated. The Métis people is bringing them together. But with all the contradictions that it takes, so even among ourselves, we're like, so sometimes back in the days, Métis were like, hey, I can claim to be an Indian and jump into that treaty, for example. So I'm going to take treaty rights. Oh, I'm tired of those treaty rights because now it's pinching on me for certain restrictions due to the Indianness. Hey, I'm white and I'm going to take 160 of these acres of land. And so the authorities were like, are you white or are you Indian? You have to make your ways. No, well, I'm Métis. And the colonial authorities in Canada said, we don't deal with Métis, like they say in the Treaty of 1850, for example, with your people. They said, like, look, either you put yourself under the tutorship of these Indian chief, or either you accept to be white, and we will kill off your Indian blood rights by giving you 160 acres of land. And this is what they did in Manitoba. They gave the script to extinguish the claim of indigeneity to these people. So it was by blood at first that people had a special rights to the land by connecting to different nations, right? So it is a very tricky and complex history, but yet we are born out of these contradictions. The Métis people are bearing that history, these connections and these responsibility, and we have to have the courage to say, yes, we have contradictions, but we're still a people with relationship, with responsibility, and a significant part of that history, including American history and Canadian history.
I did want to mention a documentary you should watch. The film star named Roy Dupuis did one on the relationship between Québécois and also Native Americans called L'Empreinte.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful film, really looking at how Québécois culture tried to distance itself from its Native American roots, when in fact much of Québécois culture is deeply influenced by their Native American connections. So, yes.
I think you've done a great job of trying to answer what my question is, but let's make sure I have the right question. Is it about money, or is it about culture?
Well, it's hard to say. It depends on the people and the individuals almost, right? Some people will say, well, what can I get from this? Well, I'll get free education. The first question comes. And for other people, it's about recognizing themselves. It's about becoming whole again, right? Resilience, indigenous resilience has many aspects. But sometimes I'm challenged by that question and say, look, these people just want to have money. They just want to, ride that wave that indigenous people did hope in, and then they play the so-called Indians. And what I suggest to those people is that we don't know who's going to be the next Tecumseh or the next great leader. If some people have ancestral connections, for me, I respect their ancestral connections and their possibility of resilience. If they come with bad ideas about this, I cannot control that. And maybe their children who are brought into the culture will become the next leader that we need for different sets of situation, which I don't know the future. So therefore, if individuals have bad intent when it comes to indigenous culture, I think that the most important, valuable lessons is the belief in culture. And the strong culture will protect future individuals, hopefully, against misleading ways by bringing them back into their culture. But can we protect indigenous culture from all possible aspects of fraud or money or bad intent? That would be really hard. But can we push indigenous culture to resilience and to accept individuals that have been lost to them? I think that's a very valuable enterprise, my way.
Just to follow up, most people in power like to keep those not in power divided and fighting among themselves. Is that at play?
In Canada, very much so, it is at play. And what's even more brutal about it is that, unfortunately, First Nations could be involved into this. There's huge tension with non-status and Métis people and First Nations in Canada right now in certain part of the country. And as example of this, I am working on a book for the Eastern Métis populations in Acadia and other parts of town. And the Mi'kmaq First Nation, which I have huge respect for when it comes to their history, their culture, the thoughts that they have. Many of their chief came out, and we didn't even publish our result yet, that they've asked the government of Canada to stop any funding of our research because they didn't want this research to come out on the Acadian half-breeds. Due to the fact that they're still negotiating treaties. So sometimes we find ourselves fighting among our own, in our own relations, because we want to get what? We want to get colonial recognition, certain pockets of money, and certain rights. And we forget that perhaps there's other way to get across these conflicts. Old diplomatic ways that were already there at the time of First Nations dealing with Métis people. And we have to keep in mind that the First Nations people were there first. And their intrinsic right, negotiating with a Métis or a Canadian or an American, won't change. So the Métis people have to adjust to that reality. And just like Indigenous people are negotiating among themselves, it is possible to make a space and make a place for Métis people to exist, yet with the understanding that this comes with responsibility when it comes to their relationship, as well as other Indigenous people that may exist next to them, that's for sure.
I've read much of the Riel Rebellion. Was that a rebellion of self-determination, or what other factors weighed into it in terms of it spilling across the border into the U.S.?
Yes, thank you. Well, we call it most likely to resistance. Some people are particular about the word rebellion versus resistance, but the two at play were a bit different, right? So, but it was definitely about securing land and securing the possibility of existence in the aftermath of the American and English War, with more loyalists coming up north and taking up lands, as well as new sets of newcomers and immigrants, pushing the Métis people to having no rights recognized due to the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation in 1763 said that all of these Indian lands, so to speak, were now protected by the king, and you had no rights on it, except if the king would allow you to live there or get, proper property and things like that. And for the Métis people that were existing there 100 years prior, they found themselves with no rights at all and no indigeneity recognized to them almost, basically due to patrilineal lines like I've explained it earlier. So they were in a no man's land, trying to find rights for themselves and identities, and that has led to resistance when the British came and says, we will survey the land now. We will take the best land prepared and give it to our settlers. And the French Métis did resist in alliances with a number of First Nations that also led into battles and fought colonialists at that time. The second resistance was crushed by Canadian military. And basically from there, they captured Louis Riel, and he was hanged and executed in 1885. But all these memories of struggle have built a very profound sense of Métis nationalisms out west. And these stories belong to the Red River Métis Nation. What I'm suggesting in my research is that other Métis communities across the land did exist as well. And we share a culture that is rhizomatic, which means by this that we don't have a unique center of culture. We have many dots of culture that connects and weave through the history of fur trades and its subsequent developments across various colonial lines and borders. And that culture is shared and takes different coloration and different history per their localities, as well as the different relationship they have locally with indigenous people. And all of that can coexist. Now, some people disagree with me and says, no, Sebastien, because all of these other half-breed and Métis people didn't acquire historically a sense of themselves as a people. Only the Red River Métis, through their resistance, acquired that sense of maturity as a people. And they're using that argument now in universities and across in politics to discount the experience of other Métis across Canada that we yet even sometimes don't even know due to the lack of records and the fact that we didn't take it seriously for some times due to colonialization. So I'm asking these Red River Métis proponents, for example, to just accept the fact that we can coexist, honoring our differences, and all be proud descendants of Métis people or sans mêlé. But it's still a hard quest, right? Because basically a lot of Métis people unfortunately mimic the categories of colonization by which they want to mirror those political language. They want to mirror those political existence and say, we are a nation too. Yes, you could be a nation, but you don't have to mimic the violence of colonizing nation into what you're doing. I don't know if that's too much of a long answer, but...
There's another documentary being shown tomorrow night at 9 o'clock on PBS. It's called Medicine Fiddle. I made it. It's about Métis fiddling. But one thing I want to mention, in the course of making it, I was told a story about Sugar Island, a guy from the same Sugar Island that Marty is talking about, a guy from the Bureau of Indian Affairs was visiting. So the native people wanted to honor him. So they imported headdresses from the Sioux, even though that was not their custom, just to put on a good show.
Yeah.
And they had a drum. And as soon as he left, they broke out their fiddle and started dancing amongst themselves. When I was trying to figure out what to name the film, the first idea I had was to call it Devil Shake a Half-Breed, which is the name of a very, very popular Métis tune. And because the Catholic Church tried to suppress it and so on, burn the fiddles, you know. Excuse me. The older people thought that's a great title. A younger person, a friend of mine, Kathy Narcooley, she said, that'll cause a race riot. And so we called it Medicine Fiddle and escaped that particular issue. But that tune, Devil Shake a Half-Breed, really kind of captured it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that comment. Very much so.
So, Sebastien,
Yes.
great presentation. I had a question regarding wannabes and pretendians. Okay, so we often, if it's localized, Wishanabes. Anyway, it seems like, you know, as far back as I can remember, we've had this label for people who want to be Indian, but they have no ancestry whatsoever that they can show
Right.
Proof. And we refer to them as wannabes. We've seen it happen, I mean, as far back as, you know, Grail, right? I mean, we can see instances in the media and stuff. It seems like there was always this tendency in the United States to glom on, the wannabes wanted to glom on to Cherokee. The old joke is they all have a Cherokee princess. So, I mean, either this woman had a bunch of kids Or there's a lot of princesses out there that we didn't never know about, right? But then they started to also glom onto Blackfeet or Blackfoot. They, both titles, they said, okay, I'm not going to say I'm Cherokee because people laugh about Cherokee. Now I'm Blackfoot or Blackfeet. So now we have people who are starting to say I'm Métis. And it's becoming one of the wannabe categories. How are Métis people who are truly Métis reacting to that?
Well, that's a good question. I react myself with the teaching of Louis Riel. So basically, when people are challenging me to identify as Métis, I'm referring back to Louis Riel. I'm saying, what is a Métis? Well, I come from French Indian backgrounds, from the fur trade, a dissented people from various places. But there's people who disagree with me. I will say, no, you need to be specific to a nation, and they will bring primordialist argument into it. Going back to that question, so there's no clear answer, but going back to anxiety about the indigenous questions, that's a very old thing. That's a very old team. And I would say it's a predominant white team, predominant colonizing team. People that will say, well, they're afraid of who's not really indigenous. Because, remember that I would like to suggest that for the white folks around is that an indigenous people is their past. It's remnant in the zoo. It goes back to authenticity. You have to hold it together, and that shows the departure line by which civilization offshoot and the white, progress happen, future-orientated. And you will forbid the First Nations to be in the future. They'll be in the past. They'll be dwelling on the past. They'll be arguing still for their treaty. But they have no actualizations of their rights and their possibility of a living culture that says we are an indigenous country. And if we are an indigenous country, and if the culture is predominant, then you will bring people, newcomers, as indigenous people eventually. Just like you make them Americans, you can make them into indigenous cultures. Now, the bad thing is that when people don't have ancestral connections and they claim that they're having ancestral connections, they're taking the place, it is suggested, of indigenous people, and that is seen as bad, including for the Métis people. I'm saying just be authentic with who you are. And the path of the Métis people, to take just that example, is a path of humbleness, at least for me, in my experience. People says, do you have indigenous ancestry or ancestral relationship? And they will challenge that. And then you say, yes, I have. Then the next question is going to be, well, you don't have enough, or it's too far, or it's too little. So what is enough? Why are we thinking in terms of blood quantum when Louis Riel himself said, you don't have to have blood quantum to be a Métis person. Louis Riel says that himself in 1885 in his letters. So basically, a Métis, when is a Métis assimilated? Once a question was asked to an elder, and the elder said, when that Métis person decide to be assimilated. So for the Métis people, because they're part in boat canoe, they always have this existential choice of blending with whatever culture they may choose. So people are like, that's unfair, because I didn't have that choice. I was on the res, and I was under duress, and my grandmother went to residential school, and I say, yes, that's true. And as a Métis person, as a white passing Métis person, you don't have the same right in terms of historical responsibility when it comes to compensation, things like that. You don't have the same, it's not pan-indigeneity here. We have to make specific claims, specific relationship per our own experience and being humble about it. And I think that the path of a Métis person, at least in my case, it's a path of humbleness, claiming what you are in terms of relationship and the possibilities of resilience. Is it a perfect story? No. Is it full of contradictions? At times. But I think that the pretendian conversations and the fake identity conversation, it has certain truth to it that we have to honor, but it's extremely dangerous as a game, I would suggest, because it crushes the possibilities of resilience. And I had numerous students with ancestral relationship that are now shy to am I going to go up front and talk about my relationship? No, because I'm afraid of being shy about it. I'm going to be ridiculed about this. I'm going to be told what are you? Have you lived experience of indigeneity? Do you speak the language? So you see that the witch hunt for the authenticity of indigenousness is endless. It will pursue itself till it self-devour itself. And I think that at some point we have to make it stop in terms of self-determination, in terms of sovereignty for indigenous people, but we have to take into consideration that there's a number of indigenous people there that are still trying to come to self-determination and recognition. Some people are not there yet, and we have to make sure that these people have a right to exist as well and to self-determine themselves. So it's a complex answer, but hopefully that puts it a little bit.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to have to move on
Thank
to
you
the
so
last
much, guys.
session.
Thank you.
So thank you, Sebastien. It was wonderful.